So, the intention of this video is to serve as a guide for generating threat primarily for warriors, but will serve as a general tanking guide with information applicable to all classes. So, starting off, what is threat? There's a lot of good descriptions of what threat is on the internet, but if you need a different way than the norm of thinking about it, I like to think of it as a metric for measuring a character's gravitational pull. Most actions you perform while in combat will generate threat, from the obvious ways like dealing damage to the less obvious ways like applying buffs to your party, chugging health potions to restore life, building rage through the use of blood rage or rage potions, etc., etc. All these generate rage, increasing your pull, and the mobs will be drawn to the character with the greatest pull. This becomes increasingly relevant now as most guilds have cleared it, but as we progress into Blackwing Lair, and future bosses as new raid tiers come out, there will be taunt immune mobs, and it will be necessary to know how to generate sufficient threat, because you will not be able to taunt the mobs back to you as a crutch to mitigate poor threat generation. So how do you lose aggro? And just formally defined real quick, aggro would be if you have aggro on a mob, you are the top threat person. That is just a shortcut term for saying I'm the highest threat. I have the greatest gravitational pull. How do you lose aggro? Well, it depends. So you can see in the video here a good example of something that you maybe shouldn't do. No shade to Hadriel, but in melee range you have to exceed the top person's threat by 10%. You have to generate 110% of their threat in order to pull threat off of them. Whereas if you are at range, you will need to exceed their threat by 30%, or generate 130% of their rage, and you will then pull aggro. This becomes tricky in a lot of circumstances, and as you saw, the mage was standing within melee range, and so the blizzard generated threat and exceeded the 110% threshold, whereas if they were further back, they would have had much more of a buffer. Another thing that is helpful is to mark targets. You'll see me marking skulls on a primary target. Beyond that, I should have sufficient threat. Additional marks aren't usually necessary in a dungeon like this, but marking targets indirectly helps with your threat, because you can overload one mob and then feel comfortable spreading out your threat across other mobs as that primary target dies off. You could see the skull there I had sufficient threat on, and it never stopped attacking me, even though I was not attacking it. Past the point that it had like 80% HP, I didn't touch it, but it stayed on me. Marking skulls focus fires, ideally, if your DPS are paying attention, the threat, so that you can overload one target and then focus on tab targeting, so that you can maintain AoE threat more easily. It's also worth noting, as a side note, that you should have multiple gear sets as a tank. You should have a mitigation set. I like to have a set with some like thorns effects for dungeons sometimes, but you should also have a separate threat set, which is going to be lower mitigation but higher DPS stats, and that will allow you to generate higher threat per second, as it is basically 100% of the time threat is the biggest factor to consider in progression. As you get better and better gear and your guild gets more and more progressed through content, threat will be your limiting factor, not mitigation. Your DPS will do enough damage that bosses will die quick enough that healers can just spam high rank heals and keep you alive. Contrary to the old private server meta of getting 440 defense and becoming defense capped. That just simply is not a thing in Classic. The mobs just don't hit hard enough for that to be relevant, but people are much better at the game nowadays, and so they deal a lot more damage and generate a lot more threat, and you need to be ready for that. So I recommend a threat set with a lot of strength, agility, of course sufficient hit rating, and crit. So, samples. You're going to have multiple scenarios where you need to generate threat in different ways. That being single target, like a boss fight, where everybody is focused on the same mob for the entire fight. And then AoE fights, such as the ones you're witnessing here. And the type of fight that you are engaged in will determine the way in which you approach it. So in terms of generating single target threat, you always want to pool rage whenever possible between pulls. And you want to be able to learn as you tank and get more comfortable to get a feel for when you're way ahead on threat, so that you can start banking rage and maybe only cast low rage cost abilities like Revenge to maintain threat, but ultimately when you have a threat lead and mobs are dying, like right here in this video example, I'm going to load up threat on this Torturer, but if I continue to use abilities past this point here, I'm doing it incorrectly. So now I have 18 rage going into the next pull, and that is what you want to do, because then I can go in and get one auto attack off and already have enough to start sundering. When you're doing, so for single target threat, which is what we're going to start with, assume you're fighting a boss in a raid. These are the most crucial situations where you must maintain threat. And again, as you progress into Blackwing Lair, if you haven't already, you must generate high threat because you cannot taunt a lot of the bosses in there. If you lose threat, it's going to kill your raid. So it is worth noting that if you can't pool the rage prior to the pull, which is going to happen sometimes, you should be ready to pop a Mighty Rage Potion and or use the ability Blood Rage potentially before the pull, even though they generate threat. Because you want to go in and generate what I call snap threat. Again, this is primarily going to be from the warrior's perspective, as they are the de facto tanks. And the individuals that I'm looking for this guide to be effective for in our guild are also warriors. But this should apply to other classes as well. You're just going to use different abilities. But you want to generate high threat right out the gate. As a warrior, you would do this by queuing a heroic strike, and in the same global, immediately using Shield Slam or Bloodthirst, depending on your spec. And then ideally, after that global finishes, you're going to be able to queue up another heroic strike and use Revenge. Ideally, you've gotten some sort of avoidance maneuver in there to trigger the Revenge proc. From there, Sunder Armor is great. You want to be stacking Sunders, both for the DPS and your damage output's sake, and it's just a good threat per rage, bread and butter ability. But the highest threat per second you can generate in the game as a warrior is to get a fast dagger. It's not realistic to get it, but Alcor Sunraiser I think is pretty much top tier, but any dagger really will do. Fast dagger plus a plus dagger skill item, such as Mugger's Belt or the Core Leather Gloves. Your rogues might have a problem with that, but technically this is the highest threat per second and will benefit your raid on fights like Vale and BWL. And they'll be thanking you because they'll be able to do super high parses without getting torched by the dragon. So if it's feasible, you should aim to get a fast dagger. You can use Finkel Skinner from the Beast in Upper Blackrock Spire on the front end before you get a Molten Core dagger. But the highest threat per second is using the dagger. The reason that you use a fast dagger is so that you can spam Heroic Strike as much as possible. On fights where you're taking high damage in raids, you're going to have near infinite rage as the fight progresses, and the ability to just dump as many heroic strikes into the boss as fast as possible in defensive stance with Defiance talented, mixing in Bloodthirst or Shield Slam, whichever spec you are, and then Revenge procs as you go is going to be the highest potential threat per second that you can deal in a single target scenario. So that's how I would open. I would queue Heroic Strike and then Shield Slam or Bloodthirst, depending on your spec. And then I would continue to queue Heroic Strike with the Dagger spec whenever you're able to, and mix in Bloodthirst and Revenge as you're able. If you're in a threat-starved scenario, you do want to prioritize Shield Slam or Bloodthirst. Shield Slam is your highest threat per rage ability for a warrior. I think Revenge being the second highest given the extraordinarily low rage cost. AoE threat for a warrior is where it gets a little bit more tricky. But this is where we're going to utilize a warrior's skill set. So a warrior in defensive stance generates 130% additional rage. Additional threat. And then in the prot tree you have the Defiance talent. And if you talent that, they stack multiplicatively, which should increase your threat output by about 149%, I believe. And the nice thing for a warrior is this applies to all of your abilities, including things like engineering, which is why engineering is always cited as being essentially mandatory for all tanks. And as a warrior, having engineering is pretty much mandatory for maintaining threat in AoE situations. Without it, you are kind of gimping your capacity to generate area of effect threat. So because of what we learned earlier about establishing threat and then melee needing to exceed you by 10%, ranged by 30% in order to pull threat, it's important that the very first step, both single target and AoE, is that you establish threat on the pull. You want to be the one that pulls, you want to be the first name on the threat meter. You want to be the first name so that anyone else would have to exceed you by a percentage in order to pull, instead of you having to then rapidly work to pull off of them, exceeding their threat by a percentage right off the pull. This is why if you're in a dungeon run and you have an overzealous mage or hunter pulling ahead of you, and the hunter won't feign death for some reason, I'm sure you've been in these scenarios before, they're just in a hurry, it's very difficult for you to re-establish threat because your AoE threat generation is so poor, and they are the ones at the top of every mob's threat meter if they are the ones to initially pull and generate combat. So, in order to get in there, and you'll see me doing this in this clip, I've done it several times already. Again, this is not a super try-hard clip. I probably should have done a try-hard clip, but this is what you get. But some of the lessons should be in here. You'll see me pulling at range, whenever possible at least, so that I can get the initial threat on all the mobs by entering combat. And then from there you will pop Blood Rage, because generating rage through an ability generates threat. You will then buff your party with Battle Shout, which again generates threat per person buffed, split amongst all mobs currently in combat, which again, boom, AoE threat on everybody. And then I typically will LOS whenever possible, line of sight the mobs by going around a corner, forcing them to come to me, and then I apply Demoralizing Shout. Let's see if I do it here. Okay. So initial threat, Demoralizing Shout, pull them around the corner. And this is where it becomes difficult. So that part is not hard. You can get in a nice rhythm every pull of pulling, Blood Rage, Battle Shout, Demoralizing Shout on the mobs. And really, the DPS shouldn't be starting until they're around the corner anyway. So this allows you the globals to get your buffs up and pop Blood Rage without people blizzarding already. You can see me doing it right here. So, Battle Shout, they're around the corner, Demoralizing Shout. So now I have threat on all the mobs. The trick here for a warrior is maintaining your threat. Maintaining AoE threat per second is a challenge. And this is where a lot of people are going to struggle. You can see that these mobs are still on me. And that is no easy task in larger pulls. In this clip, I have Thorns and Retribution Aura, plus a Thorium Shield Spike, and all these things together help a ton for maintaining passive threat per second as the fight goes on. The need is not really here because my gear is good enough, but normally in progression content or really tough content, you'd want to be using engineering bombs, oil of immolation, any thorns and spike effects you can get, and then from there you want to be of course marking a skull, loading it with threat, but then you want to be tab targeting around, which is what you see me doing here. That is what you should do in an AoE situation. It might seem counterintuitive, and a lot of people will try to stance dance, to whirlwind, or to thunderclap. You should not do that. When you thunderclap or whirlwind, you are dropping out of defensive stance, and Berserker stance has an implicit 0.8 times multiplier to threat output, whereas defensive stance is 1.3. So you are chopping off a huge percentage of the threat you would generate, and taking more damage, and likely dropping rage off your rage bar, because Tactical Mastery will only allow you to retain up to 25 rage when you switch stances. It is not worth it, and I do not recommend stance dancing in the middle of a pull in order to attempt to use an AoE technically ability. It simply is not worth it. You should be tab sundering, and if you just have an embarrassment of riches on your rage, you can start using Cleaves, but I personally am not a huge fan of the Cleaves because it starts to gimp your rage generation, because it replaces your next auto, much like Heroic Strike. When you do that, you gimp your ability to generate rage, which is then going to have your rage bar plummet and allow you to ultimately, over time, generate less threat per second. At least that's my opinion. When you tab Sunder, you're still getting regular autos off, and generating more target on each mob struck with the Sunder than a Cleave would, due to its implicit high threat generation. So, don't stance dance, tab Sunder, and watch closely and intently for mobs to get pulled off by somebody spamming Blizzard or multi-shot or whatever it happens to be. You can see I have visible nameplates enabled at all times on enemies. This makes it really easy to click. It makes it easy to see what their health is at, and it also makes it easier to see which mob is going where. And you can quick click and taunt if you lose threat on a mob. So the sample AoE pull, let's say it's a big pull and it's going to be a hard pull, and I want to make sure that I maintain high AoE threat per second on all the mobs. So before the pull, I want to make sure that I have my Thorns effects up if they are available. You could also pop an Oil of Immolation going into the fight. It's going to be a tough fight. Lots of small mobs hitting you in rapid succession. Your shield is going to do a whole lot for you there. So have your shield on with a shield spike if you prefer. You are going to pull at ranged in an ideal scenario, pop Blood Rage, and Battle Shout to buff your party. LOS the mobs, and then Demo Shout. Here, we're going to do it right here. Blood Rage, Battle Shout, auto to get some rage, they come around the corner, Demo Shout. And here you'll see me start to tab Sunder. If this was a harder pull, you would also want to drop some dynamite on them right after that Demo Shout to get some good spike AoE threat to give you a buffer while you tab Sunder around. Now when you see me get a Revenge proc, you'll see that I don't wait a second global to get the Sunder on a mob. Just toss out the Revenge. Revenge is better threat per rage than Sunder. And so if you get a Revenge proc, instead of the Sunder, just toss a Revenge on the mob and tab to the next one. That is sufficient rage or threat generation for that mob. An example of a scenario where the AoE threat can become a problem and you don't want the mobs to split would be the dogs in Molten Core by Lucifron and Magmadar. Ideally in that scenario, you want your main tank to just get initial threat and get big AoE threat, maybe via Goblin Sapper Charge, with Thorns Effects, Battle Shout, Demo Shout, Blood Rage, all that. Just going all out. Off-tank should be, one, watching for runners, and also generating high single target threat on 1 to 2 mobs each, instead of trying to exceed the initial tank's AoE threat thresholds through their own AoE abilities. In this, you will effectively pull 1 to 2 mobs with your single target threat output, which is going to be way better than your AoE threat output. Effectively splitting the mobs across the tanks and preventing runners from getting into the raid. Marking those targets also helps. You can assign off tanks to marks. Pulls like that are just not that hard. I don't think it's necessary, but if you wanted to get some practice in for splitting mobs, it's not a bad idea. So that is kind of where I'm going to leave it for now. Hopefully that was helpful. Probably a little rambly. But that is an intro to threat generation in single target and AoE situations. Any questions, leave a comment or hit me up separately. Thanks.